So we've heard a couple of times this morning that if people don't trust AI, they're less likely to use it. And I think there's a strong parallel there that we can see with genetically modified crops from the late 80s, where people didn't trust what was going to happen with genetically modified crops. They weren't developed. And particularly in Europe, we ended up falling a long way behind. And in fact, I'd say the whole world fell quite a long way behind where we could have been with using things like disease-resistant development with crops. So there's clearly a link between trust and technological innovation and development. And I think we see the same thing now with AI. If we don't trust AI, if we don't trust technology, then we risk losing the benefits that could come from it. There was a survey carried out or published at least in October by the Institute of Directors in Ireland about the number of directors that plan to use AI. 41% were not using it at the time, but intended to use it. 58% recognized ethical risk as being a significant challenge to their company, and yet 53% had no IT strategy in place. And 75% weren't aware of what the scope of the AI Act was. So for those of us who are looking to the AI Act to sort of save us and to provide some ethical boundaries, that clearly wasn't going to happen there. Each year, for the last couple of years, Sopra Steria has carried out some research into citizen trust. Gone out and asked people, carried out a survey of 1,000 people across the UK as to what their feelings were about government services, online services in general, around how they trusted what these services were providing. And so that's really where I want to go with this presentation. Obviously, it was carried out before the AI Safety Summit, so bear that in mind as I share some of these results with you. So just starting out from some baselining, we asked essentially, do you find people trustworthy in general? People aged over 65, 63% of them said yes. People aged under 25, 37% said yes. So generally speaking, people under 25 are far less trusting of individuals than the older generations. This doesn't mean that we're necessarily facing a big cohort of cynical people moving through society. It may just be that generally speaking, people under the age of 25 are less trusting. At the same time, it could mean that we're seeing declining levels of trust coming up in society. We also asked if people trusted the way in which data was being used by different bodies. In the case of healthcare, 63% trusted how data was being used. In the case of government, 44% trusted how data was being used. And in the case of social media, a mere 20% trusted how data was being used. So that gave us some sort of baselines to start out the research with. We then wanted to dig a little bit further into the nature of trust and what do we mean by trust. Now, there are, generally speaking, two sorts of trust we can talk about. There's competence trust and moral trust. If you like, with competence trust, this might be an odd way of putting it, but I can trust that if a bus hits me at 50 miles an hour, I'll probably die. Okay? There's no moral aspect to what the bus is doing. However, if the driver of the bus sees me, I might trust that the driver of the bus would try to swerve to avoid me. That would be the moral element of trust there. So we use trust in both of those senses. So we asked people whether they trusted various groups to collect and use data ethically, and whether they trusted these same groups to provide quality services. In the case of healthcare, there was a very high response. 70% said yes, they trusted the ethical collection and use, and 69% said they trusted quality services as well, so pretty high on both standards. For financial services, again, very similar, a lower score, 56% and 54%, but again, there's a similarity there between the ethical collection and use and the quality of services. In the case of government, only 45% of people felt that they trusted the government to collect and use data ethically, whereas 52% trusted government to have quality services in what they were doing. So it was a lower level of trust than in competence when it came to government use. That was then, funnily enough, reversed with social media, that in the case of social media, only 27% trusted the ethical collection and use, but 42% trusted the quality. We also asked, this was something which struck us last year, of do you think that following the law in terms of data protection is sufficient in order to protect your data? Last year, we only asked that about government services, and 70% of people said no, following the law is not sufficient, we expect more. This year with the government, that went up to 72%, with financial services, 75%. So for people who think GDPR is sufficient and just meeting that minimum government regulation is enough, approximately 3/4 of the population disagree and would like to see more. Given the nature of the year that we've had, and that I think has been raised in virtually every talk that we've had so far today, we couldn't avoid talking about generative AI. So we did ask people if they'd heard about it, if they knew about generative AI. 79% of respondents said yes, they had heard about it to some degree. Now, coming back to this morning's panel, the degree to which they understood it is perhaps questionable, but people were at least responding to that. And I think that it was quite interesting. We then asked them what were their concerns about generative AI. A majority, 55%, were concerned that it wouldn't be fully understood. 53% said that it posed a risk to privacy. 52% that it posed a risk to jobs. Slightly less than 50%, 46% saw it as a risk to the future of society, and 42% as a risk to the safety of humankind. Now, often when I'm in kind of groups like this, there's a general sort of titter at that moment, should I say, of people going, yes, what do the public know? Those of us in the AI world know that there's no risk to humankind with this. But I think what it really shows is the impact of the discussion that's been had in the public space, letters by Elon Musk and others, that have talked about the existential risk. We've talked about the AI Safety Summit. Again, earlier on, we heard, your perspective was Terminator. And that's kind of the view that a lot of people have. And there's this sense that this is a major risk to us. It was also the case that the concern about the future of society and the safety of humankind was highest amongst the professional classes and students. Unemployed and homemakers were much, much lower. Arguably, because they've got bigger issues to worry about right now. Thank you for a couple of nods at the back. Yes?
So just a quick question with regard to humankind. Do you define humankind in that context as being the entire human race being eradicated, or do you mean risk to humans generally? So, for example, Boeing's issue with the taking over the control of the flight, telling the pilots that it was actually going to stall when it wasn't, and killing hundreds of people, or maybe somebody making it, somebody in the military giving control to weapons systems which result in hundreds of deaths without that intention.
That was a great question. It was a quantitative survey, so I couldn't go into too much depth, unfortunately. We just simply asked about the future of the safety of humankind. It's as simple as that. So how people interpreted that is a bit of an open question. And invariably, and I think, Tim, you can go on and talk in a moment about the qualitative research, obviously, that you've been carrying out. Final point, then I'll conclude and shut up. We can go to the discussion, go to Tim and to James in the discussion. We asked about regulation. Again, a big issue we've been talking about today, and obviously very live today with the AI Act being decided on. 63% of respondents felt that government ought to be the ones deciding regulation around this. A mere 29% thought that companies should be allowed to self-regulate, and that's as far as the regulation should go. That rose, the belief that government should be regulating rose again to 72% amongst professional and student classes. And when it comes to this idea that innovation might be stifled by regulation, a mere 22% agreed that regulation would stifle innovation, falling to just 10% with people over 45. So some really interesting views, I think, there on what the public feels about this. So just to kind of conclude that, firstly, I think when we're talking about trust, it's worth bearing in mind that we're talking about both ethical trust and competence trust. You can talk about something working, but whether it works in your favor is a different question. And I think we've heard a couple of times again this morning about ethics not being with the technology, but being with the use of the technology. For what it's worth, I would disagree with that very strongly. I think that the very fact that bias exists within the technology shows us that the technology itself can be biased, whether somebody intends it to be or not. Secondly, I think we need to be aware of how the conversation is shaping up and what we are doing to help shape the conversation. the more that, in my opinion, we can move away from discussion about foundation models, frontier AI, risks to the future of humankind, which I think risks overshadowing some very real problems about bias, transparency, and privacy that we could be ignoring. I think we need to focus on all of AI, as we've been hearing the way AI affects us in so many ways, and all the risks that we get. Regulation, thirdly, again, contrary to some earlier speakers, I would say regulation does not have to be onerous. It can be blanket without being onerous on everybody. And self-regulation is clearly not trusted by the public. So that's something we need to be moving away with. And as Tim Clement-Jones pointed out, as regards the Online Safety Act, I think there's good reason as to why the public is distrustful about self-regulation. And finally, then I would just, my last point would be that ethics by design is the approach we ought to take, which is essentially saying ethics needs to be thought about the whole way through the process of development and use of any technology. It is with a car. We don't just sit there and come out with a requirement that cars are safe, and then when the car rolls onto the road, we go, right, is this now safe? You know, when we design the steering column, we design it with safety in mind. When we design the axle, we design the axle with safety in mind. The side impact protection system, bumpers, body, whatever else, safety is foremost now. It used not to be, but it is now front and center of everybody's minds. And I think that ethics really needs to be front and center of everyone's minds with technology in general, but AI in particular. With that, thanks.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Some very fascinating research there, and I think we'd love to sort of dive into some of the details of the findings in a bit more detail as we kind of have our panel session now. So thank you very much.
Sure.
I'd now like to obviously bring into the conversation Tim, who joins me in person, and also James, who hopefully you can hear and see us in some form online. Hello. Good afternoon.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. Maybe just to bring you both into the conversation, would you mind maybe starting with you, Tim, just briefly telling us, I know many of us will have heard from you this morning, but a bit about you and what you're doing at Connected by Data, just to frame the conversation.
Absolutely. So thanks ever so much for the fantastic kind of start to our conversation. So Connected by Data is a campaign for communities to have a powerful voice in the governance of data and AI. It starts from a simple idea that we are all affected and different communities are affected differently. All those communities affected by this technology should be heard in its development and as much as possible should be in the loop on decision making. And we talk a lot about this kind of idea of democratizing AI, and I think it's worth breaking that apart, that does involve conversations about democratization and democratic governance of the development of models and the upstream creation of systems. It involves questions about democratic regulation of models, making sure that regulation is shaped by the concerns of members of the public, is able to sense how different communities are being affected, and is able to respond to that. And thirdly, the democratic adoption of AI, when we're choosing to use technologies in our schools, in our health systems, in our local authorities, that the people affected by that are making active choices about that from an informed position. So at Connected by Data, what we've been exploring a lot is how to have good data and AI governance that is collective, democratic, participatory, deliberative and powerful. And just to focus very briefly on that deliberative point, we talked this morning, and some of you will have heard from Janet and Sharif, who were part of the People's Panel on AI, which was our experiment in deliberative decision making. And that's the idea that we seek ways that the public can become informed about what's going on, can hear from experts, can hear different perspectives, but can then filter that through their own lived experience, get space to talk about that, to come to informed opinions and views on where we should be going as part of a conversation, which I think the last point just I'll add is that piece of trust being so vital here. But trust comes from conversation. Trust doesn't come from being told to trust something. You can't win trust just through your privacy policy or the thing we know no one reads anyway. It's got to come from those conversations, and those to be two-way conversations where people can genuinely see they're being listened to and there's a response to the concerns raised.
Thank you very much, Tim. And maybe, James, if I could come to you online, to tell us just very briefly a little bit about the public engagement work you're doing at the ADI.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've had a good day. Unfortunately, I've not managed to join any of the sessions so far. So might be missing some of the really interesting context from earlier sessions. My name is James. I work at the Open Data Institute. We're an organisation, non-profit based in London, and have a very broad mission and vision around making data work for everyone. We work with companies, governments, third sector to try and build open and trustworthy data ecosystems. And so trust and trustworthiness is really a core part of our mission as an organisation. Whereas you might be hearing a lot around kind of public participation, generally the ODI's work is more on the side of working with organisations, companies, governments, etc., to help them think about what it means to be trustworthy and to really build organisational practices, processes, and to have people in place who have skills and knowledge to really make sure that the work that they're doing around data works for people and really takes into consideration what ethics means within the context of their organisational business and what it means to the people that they are ultimately trying to create value to. So most of my focus is more on that kind of organisational side of how we bring the people closer together to the organisations and make sure that things are working in a harmonious way. Having said that, we are currently doing some work with Microsoft, who are one of our partners, looking at generative AI for non-technical users, really trying to take a sensible approach to what the potential applications could be for making data more useful. So around activities like data discovery, for example, or data analytics, and then also looking at where the limitations are. So really trying to make generative AI as a topic more accessible to people and to help them understand what the kind of practicalities are right now in the world that we live in, rather than kind of looking at the opposite ends of the hype cycle where people are talking about kind of this is going to change the world or this is going to doom the human race. So really interesting to be here, really looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent, thank you, James. And now I'd like to dive just straight into some questions, but again, from the audience, do start thinking about what you'd like to ask the panel as well. Maybe Kevin, if I could come back to you just firstly. Obviously, some of the stats you just mentioned as part of your opening remarks there, really, really interesting. But also, I guess there is, some level of concern with the amount of sort of diminishing levels of trust we're seeing in particular areas amongst particular groups within society as well. What do you think? How can we ensure that trust in government use of data and technology doesn't diminish any further?
Oh, that's a good one. I think, a variety of things which need to be done. Transparency is a good start. Just getting ethical systems in place, thinking about how data is being used, how it's being collected, processed, everything else, and then communicating that effectively to people and being transparent about it. I mean, I think James will be very clear on this one as well with the Open Data Institute about the importance of data being accessible and shareable and everything else, and coming in with you, Tim, as well, about engaging with the public. We have come across, so last year, along with this quantitative citizen survey, we also carried out some qualitative survey work with government departments. And while we found that some did engage with public stakeholder groups, none of them did so in an iterative fashion. So they might go out and speak to the public once and then say, great, we got the public's view, now we know what we're going to do. I won't go any further. But they certainly didn't go back to that group 6 months, a year later and say, okay, this is what we've done, now what do you think? And it's getting that feedback loop and that discussion, as you say, Tim, the proper two-way discussion going with the public, which I think is crucial if this is going to go forward. And there's so much benefit to be had from digital services online. A lot of us use digital services all the time. And interestingly, one of the other things that came up actually was around trust in digital services. The people who trusted student loans, there's a Freudian slip. The people who trusted student loans the least were the over 65s. And the people who trusted the student loans online the most were the under 25s. Conversely, people who trusted pensions online the least were the under 25s, and people who trusted pensions online the most were the over 65s. And so there's a certain degree to which the more in which you use these online services, the more in which you trust them. It's those of us who are sort of distanced from them who feel more distrust around them. So again, openness, engagement, discussion, I think, if you want to come in on that as well.
Tim, I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, I think that highlights a key point. If we're going to start from somewhere, we need to start from those with the lowest trust but the greatest use of the tools. Because it's very easy to say we can increase that percentage while still leaving a sizable chunk of people who are significantly affected with low trust. So when you talk about health, we recently published a piece of work called Our Health Data Stories, of qualitative work talking to people with long-term conditions about their experience of health data. And some of those experiences will get lost in the percentage, but are the ones we really need to understand, because it's that magnitude of impact that matters as well as the overall picture.
Yeah, no, really good point. James, online, any kind of reflections for you on this particular point?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that's been said so far. I think transparency and openness are kind of almost the initial stage and then the extension of that. So I think that transparency is really a one-sided action, and it's really the starting point for people being able to engage with what government, for example, are actually doing around the topic of AI, or generally around kind of digital service provision. I think openness is really opening that conversation up to allow for collaboration, to allow for feedback, to allow for people to engage. But there's also other aspects to the public participation part of that and engagement where, as Tim was saying, we really need to make that accessible to the people who kind of need it most and are likely to need to engage with the services most. So I think that those points really align with where I was thinking for this conversation. I think the other thing that's really interesting and important to consider, particularly for government as a kind of function that serves the public, is around accountability of people and intelligibility of systems. So as Kevin was talking about earlier, it's really important to make sure that we can see what's happening when decisions are being made by AI model systems, however you want to kind of reflect on them. I think one of the things that we see with the conversation around AI at the moment is that it's very difficult or very opaque to see how systems make decisions, particularly if you're not the organization who has created the technology or provides the technology. And that makes it very difficult to see where the decision has been made that's led to an incorrect or wrong or harmful outcome. I think the government, when they're thinking about particularly AI, there needs to be an understanding of how these systems make decisions, and for them to be able to go and look at the decision-making process and say, okay, here is where the problem is, or here is why something has gone wrong in the decision-making process. Because if government doesn't understand why things are going wrong and it's creating harmful impacts for people, there's no cause for correction. I think accountability of people is also really important, both in with regards to the openness angle and the public participation angle, because people want to be able to provide feedback. At least in my experience, people want to be able to say, we've noticed that something's wrong. We really want to help you by surfacing that something is wrong and to give you the opportunity to make the change to course correct. But equally, people are wanting to give positive feedback to say, this thing works really well for us. We would love you to do more of this, or we would love you to continue with this approach. And sometimes I think organizations in general, but government does this in particular, they kind of see silence as an indication that things are going right. And that's not always the case. And so I think opening up avenues for feedback and having people in place who are kind of really recognizable figures or points of contact for people to let them know where something's going wrong or right is really important to this conversation as well.
Yeah. Completely agree with you. Accountability, transparency, also a key role for the regulators, which we just heard from in the previous session with Meet the Regulators. I still have some questions, but I'm also very keen to hear from the audience. So right at the back.
Hello. You made a statement when you were discussing a point raised earlier about machines don't have any moral agency, it's all within people, and you suggested that bias being built into an algorithm means that you disagree with that position. I will state my own position that I agree that machines can have moral agency, so we're on the same side of this, even if my question sounds a little bit spiky. I think there was an interesting point that James just made there, that the organisation itself has some accountability to the individual, and people see themselves interacting with an organisation rather than individual people. It could be said under that the organisation has the moral agency within society as opposed to the individuals who work within it, especially if it's a limited company from a legal sense. I was wondering, in the research you've quoted, whether you have done or are planning to do any research into the societal norm about machines having moral agency or not.
That is a really interesting question. I'm going to avoid going down the philosophical route about discussing the difference between actors and agents, but the simple answer is no, we haven't. But I think it would be a really interesting area to start exploring. And again, coming back to Sharif's point earlier about the public viewing of AI as sort of influenced by Terminator or iRobot or whatever the latest film is, thinking about, do people see AI? And the way, clearly there's a lot of discussion at the moment, quite a few people resisting calling machine learning an AI, because traditionally we've thought of AI as having some degree of sentience, and machine learning clearly doesn't. Jeff Hinton might disagree, but some of us generally think that it doesn't. So.
Yeah, I think just one observation from the People's Panel discussions, because I think this is a key place where we need informed debate, not just the kind of public. What have we can ask a survey question that will be, what have we absorbed from the medium environment? We want to go one step beyond that to what do people think when they've had that chance to think about it. And in the People's Panel, we just did a simple exercise of sitting at ChatGPT with a few different prompts. And the prompt that for me lit up lots of light bulbs for people was when we said, just type in what's the weather, and it comes back, I'm a large language model, my knowledge cuts off. And that was a kind of penny dropping moment, I think, for many people in the room of going, okay, I can see the edges of this system now. Now I can see the edges of it. I can start understanding and working out a mental model of grappling with this. And I think one of our challenges in public deliberation is finding as many of those shortcuts as we can to seeing the edges and being able to grasp it. And once we give people the chance to grasp something, whether those are policymakers and decision makers or members of the public, we have a much better conversation into which we can then still say, well, I still think it's got agency, or I don't.
Thank you. Okay, a couple more questions in the room, so I think we'll stick to those for now, if that's okay. And your hand was up first, and then go to you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I'm Lucia from Three Hands Insight, and we run panels with people particularly experiencing different vulnerable circumstances. And I've attended the People's Panel at the AI Fringe event, and I think it was great. And I keep hearing in these conferences the importance of bringing people's voices at the center of the technology, how important it is in development, in design. And I guess, and we want to bring our research community of vulnerable people in this, but I guess, what's the next step? What do we need to actually start bringing them in the development of the technology, different technologies?
Who would like to answer that?
I can start with that.
You don't want to start with that? Yeah, I can.
I guess we've been really encouraged and challenged by the panel we ran of now thinking about what's the standing infrastructures we need to do that so that we can really scale and sustain public voice in these spaces. So no simple answers, but that's definitely something we're going to be doing a lot of work on in 2024, and really open to talking with anyone here who wants to see that happen, of how can we kind of pool resources, pool ideas, and build the network that says we have many members of informed publics ready to and supported to engage in spaces.
And from our perspective, we carry out maturity assessments, ethical maturity assessments with our clients when they ask for that. And one aspect is the degree to which they are engaging with public, with stakeholders broadly construed as people who are affected by what they do. And so they don't do as well on our maturity assessment, and that's typically a way in which we say they can improve, is by getting involved much more with the public. And I was reflecting on, I was doing some research on digital identity over the last year, and your point about minorities missing out because of the statistics, which is very key. In India, where the Aadhaar system is used, where you've got a population of 1 billion people, you can have 99% accuracy and 100 million people still are hit by that inaccurate response. And if those 100 million people are the vulnerable in society, then there's a double hit on them. So yeah, something we need to be very aware of.
I think just to add to Kevin's point, I think that there are also situations where the data that feeds the model can include information about people who aren't necessarily affected by the outcome. So one of the really interesting kind of considerations around this is the conversation about Indigenous data rights, where data about Indigenous communities is being used to benefit predominantly Western civilization. And then there is no benefit going back to the communities themselves. So I also think that there is a conversation to be had about the data that is feeding systems like this, where there may be no benefit or no impact on the community themselves, but actually there should be benefit in order for us to have a more equitable set of outcomes from using these models.
Thank you. Lady behind you, Dora.
Hi, my name's Sharuk, I'm from Canon. I just wanted to ask a question because a lot of today has been about trust and how, I guess, the public trusts organizations and so on. And you mentioned that, some organizations, they might, if they say, fine, we might have got this wrong, or how can we fix this a little bit, how can we make it better? Are there any actual case studies or examples of organizations, big ones rather, that you've seen have done that, and how have they engaged?
That's a really interesting question. The first one which springs to my mind around trust is VW and the emissions cheating scandal, going back, 10 years? They reckon now that cost them $32 billion in terms of both fines and lost sales. They reformed. They made changes. I think, for all the cynicism I might have around social media companies, when we get scandals about them, they do tend to reform, at least to a degree. And again, we can be cynical about how they do it or whatever, but there is at least a visible attempt to change, I think. So I think there are some changes there. I don't know if Tim or James, if you've got any examples.
Yeah, I think the one that comes to mind is some of the work that Gender Shades Project, Joy Bulamwini and Debaji and others did of kind of detecting racial bias in facial recognition that did lead, I can't remember the exact companies, to some companies pulling their products and kind of rethinking. However, they also tell a salutary story that then those sort of same technologies pop up in different products. So they kind of want to change from some part of the organization, but other parts had incentives to push stuff out. And I think that gets to our question earlier of organizations are both corporate entities, but also collections of individuals and don't always act in concert. So one of our key challenges is needing to be working to get the regulation right. So if there are things we think are simply untrustworthy, like there are some things where we might draw a line around certain forms of facial recognition technology, other things, and say, actually, public view is we simply shouldn't. And other areas where it's a matter of company decision, we're going to have to keep having that conversation. The conversation's never done. We need, and this comes to that point of needing real, sustainable public engagement and voice in this process.
Thank you. James, any observations?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because no one wants to admit that they've done wrong, and it's very difficult to find examples of people kind of publicly saying we've done something wrong and we want to make a change. I think Barclays is one of the examples where I'm not sure they've ever come out and kind of publicly stated any kind of involvement in anything harmful, but they've been kind of closely related to the LIBOR scandal, for example, in the past. But over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, have put lots of investment into the way that the organisation approaches ethical considerations in data projects and services. So we're definitely seeing lots of that kind of reactive change. I think it would be great to see less of the reactive change and more of the proactive approach, because it shouldn't take something to go wrong for you to consider what should be right. But there are definitely examples out there of companies and organisations recognising that they need to change the way that they approach these things.
Yeah, thank you, James. And talking of taking a more proactive approach, I know, Kevin, as part of your introductory remarks, you mentioned the importance of kind of taking an ethics by design approach. Can you maybe unpack that for us in a bit more detail? How can we be factoring in some of these ethical challenges right from the beginning of the process?
Sure. So I think the key thing there is to is to take a step back and look at the process and see how the process is functioning and recognize there are different ethical elements which arise at different stages of the process. So again, going back to the example with cars, we might have in the early days of automobiles said, right, we're going to build one, look at it, okay, how do we make this safe? Let's slap on something safety at the end. And that's kind of the way that ethics has been treated, I'd say, for the last 20 or so years, is quite often we'll build something and then we'll put ethics as a bolt-on at the end. How do we make this ethical now? How do we put some guardrails in place to make sure this isn't, that this is not ill-used? The next stage is then saying, okay, well, let's put safety or ethics in as the requirement, and then as the bolt-on. We'll put it in as a requirement, and then we'll audit it at the end to make sure it's there. I think the ethics by design approach says, okay, well, when we're designing something, we have a requirements phase. If we're talking about machine learning and data, we've got a data collection, we've got data cleansing, we've got data processing, training of models. Each of these stages, and then the eventual use, each of these stages raises different ethical issues, maybe even similar ethical questions, but often with different ethical answers to those questions. So that whole questioning needs to be throughout the process. It's not a matter of saying, we've got an ethics person, they can come in and tell us if we're being ethical. It's a responsibility of everybody involved in the process from the ground up to be saying, I need to be aware of what these problems are and I need to be asking about them and taking responsibility for them.
Yeah. And it's very much an iterative, circular process, isn't it? It's not like once the product or service has been created, that's it.
Yes.
You have to continue to be revisiting, are we addressing those ethical challenges?
Yeah.
Excellent.
I think just one bit we spoke about earlier was it's important also to take that step back and say, what direction are we travelling in? Something that People's Panel really came with, saying start from the values first, rather than we've invented the technology, let's search for a problem to solve and search for someone to sell it to. Like, let's take that step back and say, where are we heading with this? Is this serving a human need, a social need, a value? Is it delivering public value rather than simply more private capture of value? Because if it's the latter, you might not have a trustworthy service at the end of it. And actually what the evidence starts to show us is building too many of those things undermines all of the others that can deliver both social and, if need be, commercial value.
Completely agree. James, any thoughts on this, how we embed that kind of ethics by design approach? Hints and tips?
Absolutely agree with what Tim just said. For me, the conversation about ethics is striving towards the positive change that you want to see in the world or that you want to see for the people that you serve, and then considering where harmful impacts may come as a result of the approach that you take. So actually the negative impact side isn't just, we need to not do bad things. It's how do we avoid doing harmful things to people that come as a result of the change that we're trying to make. So it really needs to be driven by that kind of benefits or value conversation. I think the point you made about it being iterative is really important. One of the things that I think people tend to naturally do when they conduct a kind of initial ethics assessment is go, okay, if we do this, then this thing will happen and that's bad. And so we'll just put a mitigation in place to stop that thing. But actually, sometimes you can see positive impacts come as a direct result of your actions. And then a year down the line, something happens that then has an impact on people that you haven't kind of foreseen. So we also need to think about the degrees of consequence of our actions and whether there are things that you can kind of pick out that might come later down the line. I think some of the things that people kind of miss maybe is like, how does the service that they implement or the product that they put out contribute to behavioural changes? So you might not see those in the immediate kind of release of a product or service, but you might see those a year down the line. And also, how does it affect kind of communities who already don't have access to services or data? How does it kind of broaden that gap between people? So I think that consideration around longer term or even medium term consequences is really important. I also think that the data ethics approach really needs to be driven at an organizational level rather than a project level. So we see a lot of like pockets of good practices within organizations where you've got one kind of champion for the subject, and they go, okay, well, in my project, we're going to adopt a tool or adopt a framework, and that's going to really change the way we work, and then no one else in the organization does it. So you're not an ethical organization, or you're not an organization who's building a reputation of trustworthiness. You just have one good project that's been through a good process. So I think that people or organizations rather need to be investing in the skills of all of their staff to kind of have that fundamental understanding of what ethics means within the context that they work in. And I think that it needs to come kind of embedded in the governance of the organization, the way that the whole organization thinks and works around data. And there needs to be a consistent set of values or principles for that organization as well, which then is kind of distilled down to all of the project and service work that they do, so that everyone's really on the same page. And so that when there are any kind of tensions, that there's something to go back to say, okay, well, this is what we've all agreed. This is our kind of baseline for the organisation, and here's how we then negotiate where the challenges are. So I think there's lots of things to think about, but I think if you start thinking about it as an organisation rather than as people within an organisation, then it really helps to kind of tease out what the problems are, to build the awareness and collaboration around what this should look like for your organisation.
Thank you. Okay, I think we will probably have, unfortunately, only time for probably one last question. I think you were very quick off the mark, so I think. Oh, was it? Sorry. Okay, apologies. We'll try and fit in two very quick questions. There we go.
Hi, my name is Grace, and I work with the NHS. One of the questions that struck me was, how can we ethically strike the balance between democratization of AI, protecting privacy and intellectual property rights, especially in healthcare? And how granular should our consents within the operations sector be, and how do we ensure equity in that process?
Great question. I think we'll probably lump both together in the interest of time, so I'll also hand you my mic.
Okay, thank you. I think quickly, just for the context, was the OpenAI fight over who controls the board limited the control of the future of probably the most powerful AI technology to literally just a handful of people, and it was a debate over that. Given that the AI labs who develop the most powerful technology are the ones who really haven't done in much public engagement or democratization, do you think government needs to regulate to force them to do that?
Okay, two very meaty questions there. I will let people pick and choose the ones they want to go for. Do you mind, Tim, if I start with you?
Yeah, I can try. So I think that question, you were touching on consent in NHS kind of data management, and something we've thought a lot about is the need for both individual empowerment but also collective empowerment, because some of these decisions need to be made at that collective level of affected communities' chance to think and deliberate. Actually, the ODI recently ran quite an interesting public engagement exercise around NHS data handling in AI that there's a good write-up of, the learning from that process that I can share. But I think health is a space that's been really building this work, and there's a lot to draw on, but a need to embed the spaces for participation to be ongoing, which I guess then speaks to that second part of embedding this. So we talk about enabling, let me remember them now, encourage, enable and enforce participation. Like, you need to do all those things. Some of that enforcement can come from saying, you've got to have your impact assessments there, you've got to have evidence in your impact assessment. To Kevin's point of the audits they do, or the maturity assessments, you should have evidence that you are engaging people and that you have listened to the voices of affected communities in what you do. We actually did a brief analysis that I tweeted earlier of the AI safety policies that were published around the AI Safety Summit to look, do any of those within them include measures of public engagement by policy? And they don't really. That said, there's some promising experiments from people like Anthropic and OpenAI around democratizing or democratic inputs to model development. That's something to build on. It doesn't get to the who's setting the direction, it's very much who's setting the detail. But I think what's fascinating about that is at the engineering level, again, within organizations, people are recognizing the power they have and are feeling deeply uncomfortable about the power that they have. And I think we need to also work with workers to embed that idea of, well, we have to share that power out, even if the corporate incentive structure isn't in favour of doing that.
Thank you. James, your thoughts on that? Particularly be good to hear about, I guess, the research ODI has done with on the NHS.
Yeah, so unfortunately I wasn't involved in that work, so couldn't give you more than a kind of surface level look at it, but it was very much about kind of people's perspectives of how they interact with health services and data collection. As Tim said, we can share the report round after the panel session. I think that I completely agree with what Tim said there. Difficult to speak to the IP considerations as I'm not a lawyer. I will say that there are lots of different approaches to the deployment of AI models in the same way that there are lots of different approaches to the deployment of software. I think one of the things that we need to look at is the proprietary versus kind of open source. So there are open source options, and I think that some of the same considerations apply to them. There are obviously lots of conversations around IP versus openness. I don't think the two are running kind of against each other. I think that you can retain your IP while still making things more open and more transparent. And really, the important bit for a lot of the conversation around AI is what data is feeding the system and what outcomes are essentially impacting the people. And I don't think that necessarily the conversation around IP, at least on the technology, comes into that. So I think that the conversation around technology and people have like their intersections, but aren't necessarily kind of like there are kind of independent considerations there. I think one of the interesting things to think about as well is who is providing the technology, and then who is the organisation who's actually kind of using or implementing the technology to achieve an outcome. So government, more often than not, are not going to be building the tech. They're going to be using it to create some sort of outcome. And I think an important thing for the organisations who are essentially procuring those services is thinking about what their ethical framework is and what principles they have, and then ensuring that providers they work with reflect those principles in the way that they work. That's one of the things that I would say to people to consider if they're looking at procuring AI systems or technology for a particular purpose, is does that organisation's approach reflect your values? Because if you run into problems a few years down the line where there is some sort of wrongdoing or scandal or poor outcomes from the application of the model, it may be the case that you're locked into a 10-year agreement with a technology provider and you can't get out of that, or it may be the case that you have embedded that system in the way that you work, and then it's really costly for you to get out of the agreement because you would need to replace your entire kind of technology stack, for example. So I think that's one of the important things for organisations to be thinking about when actually looking at who they work with.
Thank you very much. Now, unfortunately, we have run over time,
quickly.
but I would love to give the final word to you, Kevin.
In answer to your question about government regulating openness, well, yes. Ideally, international standards for openness, as Luciano Floridi was just saying, if we can get those, even better still, because they meet the cross-border challenges that we might otherwise have. As regards balancing privacy, IP, and transparency, again, I don't necessarily see that as actually the problem that some people do. I think it could be put forward as a smokescreen for not being transparent. There are ways you can train up an algorithm, you can train up a system, and then use synthetic data to demonstrate it. You don't have to be transparent to the public. You could be transparent to a regulator or an auditor, and then still maintain the privacy-preserving aspects of it. When we look for, it was mentioned earlier, when I buy a car, I don't understand how the car works, but I trust that somebody else has given it the okay and said this car is safe. And I think the same would be true in those cases with highly technical systems. It's not that I'm the one necessarily assessing it, but I want to be able to trust the person who has.
Excellent, thank you. And apologies, I think we could go on all afternoon. There's obviously a lot to unpack here. But I just wanted to say a huge thank you to our panel, to Kevin, to Tim, to James. Thank you so much for joining us. Quick clap.
Thank you.